So I started here with this image of the pie because not only is it warm and fuzzy and makes you feel good to look at pie, but what we're talking about today is specifically the idea of collaborative negotiation, where you're looking to not negotiate only over what are the different slices of or sizes of the slice of pie that each person involved can have, but working together to create what is something even new and more expansive than what is on the table. And you may ask yourself, well, how is that possible? When you're negotiating, it feels like it's this or that. Typically, when we think of negotiation, we think of something to this effect. We're just throwing out things at one another and someone's going to cave. But the things we'll talk about today are specifically how negotiation can actually be more than a zero-sum game or a this or a that. There is a way to negotiate in which you can create what is a win-win-win solution. It's both good for you and the other parties, and ideally good for the world because you've come up with better solutions now that you've collaborated rather than only competing against one another. And so I mentioned that this particular session in the description was based on the Harvard Negotiation Project. And I'm sharing that to acknowledge this is not going to be a completely academic presentation. The purpose of this is to think about practical application of how you can use this. Because whether we realize it or not, we are often engaged in at least 3 to 4 negotiations per day. Something as simple as where would you and your partner like to go to dinner is a negotiation. When your coworkers are trying to get time on your calendar to perhaps meet about something, that in itself is also a negotiation. So you negotiate quite frequently, and as a adult, you've probably been doing it for quite some time because every time we are trying to persuade someone to do something or take an action, we are negotiating, which is essentially every time you communicate. When you are even just sharing information, that's a negotiation in hopes that the person is actually listening to you. That's one of the things you're negotiating in that moment. And although as a child, we typically only know one way to negotiate, which is to cry for all of our needs and beat whoever's serving us into submission until they give us what we need. Now, as adults, we have a little bit more flexibility and skill in that respect so that we can negotiate more towards the interests that are involved so that it's more than the zero sum. So I'll start by telling you a little bit more about kind of this particular presentation is based on and what comes up in negotiations. So although this slide may be a little text heavy, the purpose is to acknowledge this axis here. With each negotiation, you're balancing on the left side how assertive you need to be or based on the relationship again versus how cooperative do you need to be based on the substance of the actual negotiation. So those two things are always in tension with one another in that way. This is not a good example, but you get the L-axis there. They're always in tension with one another in that way. For example, if you care strongly about the relationship and less so about the substance of the negotiation, you might be more accommodating and willing to cede a lot of the things that you want in order to make an agreement that you both can agree with. However, if you care about the substance of the negotiation more than you care about the relationship, you might be more aggressive and competitive and not worry about the long-term aspects of the relationship, but be more concerned with the outcome and getting the things that you want. So this came from in the 1970s when 2 researchers at Stanford named Thomas and Kilman came up with this model. And this is how people typically choose how they're going to behave in any type of conflict resolution. So if you think of negotiation as resolving the conflict between two different positions, then we as humans often show up in some of these spaces. And we have a typical way that we would generally negotiate, and that's usually what our default is. So here's a point where I'll ask for some of the audience. When you are generally in a negotiation, do you try to be more competitive, more accommodating, or more compromising and cooperative in the negotiation? And you can either put that in the chat or you can unmute yourselves and share it out loud. Kirby says more compromising generally. And Jake states, I tend to be more accommodating and compromising as well. So you all sound like people who appreciate teamwork and want to try to find some way to meet in the middle so that ideally everyone's needs are met. Jason notes, I try persuasion by making my argument. So Jason sounds like with the persuasion, it's a little bit more competitive, but not completely to the point where you would fully damage a relationship. So you've got a 50% success rate with that. Awesome. That seems pretty good. And our hope is that taking some of these things into account, we can have what we feel like is 100% success rate, because we're moving out of competing or compromising and even accommodating to collaboration, where it's you and the other party working together to create a solution for whatever is the quote unquote conflict. So it's you and that person against the situation or the issue versus the two of you against each other. Cliff states, my inclination is to be competitive, but I try to compromise. And although we might have a typical way that we engage with negotiations, there are times where one is better than the other. And so the first step in getting better at negotiation and figuring out how you can increase the size of the pie that you're negotiating around is just having that awareness for yourself about the type of negotiation negotiator you typically are, in order to begin to build some strategies around what's going to work best for each situation. So for example, if a close friend's in town and they really want a certain type of food that maybe isn't your favorite, what would you do in that negotiation scenario? Like Laurel said, you might be more accommodating. You want your friend to feel welcome. You want them to feel like you care about their needs. So, and the substance of the actual meal isn't as important to you. What's most important to you is the relationship. But if you were traveling to an area where you have to where culturally people typically haggle over prices in a marketplace, what might you do in that scenario? Haggle away. I love that one, Jason. You're going to be more competitive because that's what is culturally acceptable in the area, and the typical way that the vendor that you might be negotiating with is going to do, because that's what they're used to. So it's important to understand your negotiation style and use that to begin to build strategies before negotiations. Jason states, I list my constraints, but I'm open to new places. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, because the collaboration is the chance to be open to the new spaces and kind of working together to identify what is really at the core of the negotiation, so that you can protect both the substance that you want, but also that relationship as well. So let's take, for example, you are babysitting or being a caregiver for two children. You walk into the room and you see them arguing over an orange. You want the argument to stop so you can have peace, so that you can continue to be a quality caregiver. So you might just go ahead and make them stop. What are some other things that you might do if if two children were that you're caring for are arguing over an orange? You might split it. You could split the orange in half, give one to eat, give one to the other. So in this scenario, let's assume that that's what you do. You take Jason's approach and you simply split the orange. You give the one half of the orange to one child, another half of the orange to the other child. And then you notice that one child takes the flesh out of the orange and eats it and throws the rind away. The other child takes the flesh out of the orange and throws it away, and then uses the rind to make a zest for a pie. Is that the best outcome for that particular negotiation? In that outcome, no one really got what they wanted, except for maybe you as the babysitter. Perhaps you got peace, but both children were now missing out on a part that they could have had. And that's because the original argument was over, I want the orange, which is a position. And if you walk in and that's all the information you have, you may think, well, that's unmovable. They just both want the orange. But there's more underneath all of that. Beneath each of our positions are actually interests that we have. So if you had been able to explore a bit more with those children, you would have known that one had an interest in the flesh in order to eat it, and the other had an interest in the rind in order to make their pie. But neither one of them actually wanted the whole orange. And this is what we're going to talk about today in terms of collaborative negotiation and principle-based negotiation. It's about having the conversation that allows you to move from that what feels like an immovable place of position and get to the underlying interest of the negotiation and what's actually involved. Now, it may seem like, well, that's impossible. How can I actually get to that and get everything that I want? Well, there are different ways that you can approach the negotiation in order to get more of what you want and be able to provide more of what your party needs. And there are 7 elements for effective negotiation that exist in all negotiations, and it's something that you can take into account to begin to think about those other options. So as Jason mentioned, you can think about these 7 elements to begin to think about your own constraints, but to also start to open yourself up to new places that you might go into that negotiation. So with the 7 elements, there are a few things that exist before you even make it to the negotiation table. One of those is the relationship. So I mentioned originally the tension that you have between the things that you want and the relationship. So before going into a negotiation, you might want to ask yourself the question, am I prepared to deal with this relationship? Or do I understand exactly what this relationship is going into the negotiation? A good negotiating relationship is needed to address the differences and conflict and to separate the people from the substantive issues that you're actually going to address. So you want to plan and prepare and begin to think of how you might build and maintain a good working relationship, and plan and prepare for the things that you want to convey to that person. And by convey, I don't mean the things that you want and the actual substance, but I mean the sentiment and the emotion that you want to convey about how you're coming to this negotiation, and thinking about how you want to show them that you're willing to be trustworthy, respectful, and willing to make some make some concessions when, where, and necessary in order to support the relationship. But the other aspect that goes into the negotiation before you even get into the negotiation table is also communication. So you may begin to think to yourself when prepping for a negotiation, am I ready to listen and talk effectively? Uh, a few things you want to go into the negotiation with as far as core communication skills are being prepared to actively listen. You not only want to actively listen and hear the person and give them your undivided attention, but spend some time then either reflecting back what you've heard or simply repeating what you've heard to make sure that there is an understanding between one another, and continue to do that until you feel that you fully understand what they're sharing. You want to be able to speak about yourself and not them, because it's not you against this person, it's you and this person collaborating on the issue. So you want to think about that before going in as to how you want to communicate. The other thing that I try to do when preparing for negotiations is acknowledging that the relationship and the communication are things that you think about before even getting to the negotiation table, is thinking about how do those two go together. For example, I try to think about how does that person like to communicate? If they are someone who prefers text over oral communication, then maybe I might prepare some text in advance so that they have that information to take in, and it supports the way that they like to communicate. And it also helps our relationship by acknowledging that I took the time to meet them where they were. With the relationship and communication, let's say I am communicating with someone, negotiating with someone, and I know based on our relationship that they are a parent who needs their time early in the morning. Then I might not try to schedule the time that we would negotiate at a time that I knew would create a conflict or a challenge for them, because that would both affect our communication and the relationship. So before even going into the negotiation table, those are the two things that you want to take into account, both the relationship and the communication. One thing that I would say that's not listed in the 7 elements of effective negotiation, and as I mentioned, this is coming from the Harvard Negotiation Project. So if you are interested in continuing to read more about this, and a lot of it is based from the book Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreements Without Giving In, by William Ury. And one thing that they did not talk about is the context of the scenario. So for example, you might be thinking about the relationship and the communication, but you also might want to think about just the current timing and the space that we're in. So in the midst of a global pandemic right now, if one of the things you needed to negotiate wasn't a salary increase, although you're thinking about the relationship and the communication and thinking about the context and the timing, it may not be the right time to fully engage in the entire negotiation, but perhaps you're engaging in a different type of negotiation, not about the increase, but about when you might be able to formally have that conversation. So I say all of that to say, before going into the negotiation, you want to think about your relationship and the communication, but you also want to think about the context in the negotiation. So I'm going to pause there in case there are any questions about the relationship or communication, and then we'll move on to, well, what happens when I'm actually at the negotiation table? What should I be thinking about then? Okay. All right. I think I've paused long enough in that particular negotiation where I was trying to get feedback from the group, but paused long enough to know that no one had anything to share at this time. So we can continue to move on to think about, I've already done my prep on the relationship and the communication, and now I'm ready to go into a negotiation, but there's a little more prep that you can do in thinking about moving from those positions to interest. So in order to prepare for those, you want to begin to think about the interests that are involved. And that's, what do you want? And what does the other party that you're negotiating with want? What is the actual substance of the negotiation? So you might spend some time just collecting and identifying interests, concerns, or the needs relevant to the party. And you want to think about that not only for yourself, but for the other party as well. So I'll continue on the salary negotiation. My interest in going into that negotiation would to be an to have an equal exchange of value for the work that I contribute, a market competitive salary for the work that I contribute, to be seen and acknowledged as a valuable contributor to the organization. My boss's interest may be to maintain a equitable budget for salaries across their team, to make sure that they are rewarding the highest performers and retaining the best talent. And my boss also has an interest in being seen as a valuable contributor by their boss as well. So those are some of the interests that I might think of when going into a negotiation like that. Let's say, for example, your negotiation is for um housing, and you're going into that you're the buyer, you're going into that negotiation with a seller. What are perhaps some of the seller's interests that you might want to think about before going into that negotiation? Using that example, I'll share some that I would typically think about. And going into that negotiation, I know what I can think about what my interests are, and perhaps the seller has an interest in mm, going to a closing quickly so that they are able to purchase another home. Perhaps the seller has an interest in making sure their home is given to a family who would care for them and care for it the same way that they did. Perhaps the seller has an interest in making a profit from the initial cost of purchasing their home. But thinking about those in advance just helps prepare you to have a stronger and more collaborative negotiation when you're going into it, and to begin to move from the positions of, I want to buy a home, I want to sell a home, to really getting down into what are the interests that are here so that we can make an agreement that makes everyone happy. Now, once you've thought about interests, you're going to now want to think about some options that you would propose and options that maybe the other party might propose. So you'll ask yourself, what are the possible agreements or bits of an agreement that we might come to? Design those options in preparation for your negotiation. Again, thinking about options, not positions. So using the home purchase example, if you were thinking about options to appeal to a person's interest to perhaps sell quickly, saying an option of, well, I will only close in 30 days is more of a position. But if you have more options than that, like I'm willing to close in maybe 30 to 60 days, is just more of an example of an option that gives you some room to move versus a position that feels a bit unmovable. You want to do your best when you are trying to think of options, to think of options that are good for both parties. And remember, when designing options, they also must transparently meet their interests. In order to get to the collaborative point where you're now increasing the pie, you not only want to meet your interests when you're thinking about options, but you want to think about options that allow you to meet the other party's interest as well, so that when you're at the negotiation table, you have a few things that you all can discuss that are based in the interests that you need. But there is also the possibility that you or the other party might never meet each other's interests. So before going into that negotiation, you have to think about your own alternatives as well as the other party's alternatives. A collaborative negotiation ideally allows you to get to a solution that both of you can agree with, that appeals to both of your interests, and that maximizes the gains that you and the other party would have. But that's not always the case that you will be able to get there. And that's the decision point on whether you decide, can I make an agreement with this person, or should I actually walk away from the negotiation table? And that is called your BATNA. And your BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So I'm going to put that in here in the chat. So let's assume, for example, the negotiation is looking at a new position, and you're now negotiating a salary with the new organization and negotiating some of the perks. In that scenario, what might your BATNA be? Your best alternative to a negotiated agreement or accepting that position? Assuming you're already in a full-time position, your BATNA might be stay at the job that I'm at. If they couldn't meet my interests based on the options that are provided, I may stay at this job that I have now. Another scenario, your BATNA might be accepting a different position that is not something that they can offer you. So your BATNA is something that does not involve, is it an outcome that in no way involves the other party that you're negotiating with. It's something that you can do on your own, and you do not need that party to agree with. And if you and that party cannot come to an agreement that is better than your BATNA, then your best option is to actually walk away from the negotiation, which is why you need to spend some time before the negotiation thinking about your alternatives so you can define what your BATNA is and have a clear understanding of when it makes sense for you to make an agreement with someone and when it makes sense to not make an agreement with someone. And you want to identify not only your BATNA, but try your best to identify the BATNA of the other party. Again, you're making an educated guess on what these might be, but if you've done this prep in this order of thinking about the relationship, the communication, the context, their interests and options, you have a good amount of data to make an educated guess on what their BATNA might be. In the job role example, their BATNA might be to go with another candidate rather than you if the two of you cannot meet a negotiated agreement. But there needs to be some sort of measuring stick for the options that you present and the options that allow you to determine what alternatives are better or not. And those are called objective standards. And objective standards are things that both you and the other party can agree that this is a good measuring stick for the validity of the options that we're presenting here. So I've used a couple examples of negotiations here, and I'll give you some examples of what are some legitimate standards in those negotiations. I've used the home buying example. In the scenario where you're purchasing a home, what might be considered an objective standard are comparable comp sales in the area, prices of the home in the last few years, the last time it was sold. An appraisal on the house would be considered an objective standard. And those are things that both you and the other party can agree, this is a standard that I can agree on, that it's valid. And if you were to begin to present options that are within this, those can make sense to me. I can agree with that. In the example of the new role that you're negotiating for, an objective standard might be the market rates of salaries, which you could find at places like salary.com. Or if the organization has a Glassdoor profile, then there might be data there on salaries that they currently offer, and that may be considered an objective standard. In the example of negotiating with your boss for a raise. If there are salary guidelines within the organization, say, for example, your company has salary bands, then that's an objective standard that we both know if this position is in salary band 7, then it has a salary between $50,000 and $75,000. And we can both agree that that's an objective standard. If I were now to bring the option, well, I want $80,000, and we've agreed that the cap of the objective standard is 75, that's not really a viable option to use in that negotiation. So before you even get to the negotiation table, you're thinking about the relationship and the communication, and you want to prepare yourself with some interest and options that you and both the other party have that are based in some objective standards, so that you're both negotiating around something that you can both agree that's valid. In some cases, it may feel like I can't think of anything that would be an objective standard, or we're negotiating something that is completely new. There's nothing objective that exists out there to measure against. One thing that is in all of our human nature and is an objective standard across the board is fairness. And we all want a sense of fairness as humans. Now, what is fair may be a bit different for each of you, but if you don't have any other objective standard to drawing on the acknowledgement that you both want to come to a fair and equitable agreement is a place to start. And you might even then work together to identify what are some objective standards that we can use to determine some options here. And then there comes the final step of the negotiation, which is either commitment to a formal agreement or the conclusion that you've decided to go for your BATNA and you're not going to come to a negotiated agreement in this particular scenario. Now, if you do decide to make a commitment, then you want to make sure that you're both aligned with what that commitment might be. So the best agreements after a negotiation are written, and there is a clear way that you have both agreed to in terms of how you would handle it if the agreement was not actually followed through. Now, I mentioned early on that you're negotiating at a minimum 4 times a day. When you're negotiating, when you're talking with your partner about where you're going to have dinner, that in itself is a negotiation. Once you've made a commitment, does that type of negotiation have to be written? Not necessarily, but it can't hurt to send the text that, great, now we're going to X. If you change your mind, let me know, or something to that effect. But that's once you've met an agreement that you both can agree on, you've identified how you're going to implement it, and the purpose of actually getting the agreement written is just so there is no surprises afterwards that would affect the relationship or the substance of the negotiation, which we talked about in the beginning is already a tension that you have in every negotiation. So that is actually the 7 elements of each negotiation. And we initially started talking about what are our natural states and how we typically show up in negotiations. So if you're beginning to prep for a negotiation and thinking about your own strategy, you might first start by thinking about where do I show up naturally in negotiations, and thinking about the relationship and the communication and the context, and asking yourself, what's my best strategy in going into this? More often than not, the collaboration is the best strategy because it allows you to create something together. It's the 2 of you against the problem versus the 2 of you against one another. And it's focused on collaborating on creating a new solution that didn't previously exist, so that it's more of a is not a zero-sum game, but a win-win-win. And you want to spend the time prepping so that when you get to the negotiation table, you're able to have a conversation that allows you to move the conversation from positions to the interests that underlie each position that the person is presenting. And once you understand those interests, you can present other options that are related to the objective standards that you agree to, excuse me, and that are based on those objective standards that are valid. And after having that conversation, it allows both parties to make the decision on whether I should go with my BATNA or should I make an agreement and become committed. And as Jason stated, it creates this entire process creates ownership over the solution for both parties and appeals to our own, human values for not only that fairness, but for autonomy as well, in that sense of being heard, seen, and acknowledged, which at our core, we all want to do. So that is how, in short, how you negotiate to go from just these positions where it's the two of you against each other in arguing one point versus arguing interests, to not only share the pie, but increase the pie that exists, hopefully come up with something completely new together so that everyone's interests are met and the relationship is either improved or maintained. So we're about 40 minutes in, and I'm going to pause here, particularly to ask the question, if you've heard all of these things and thought to yourself, there's no way this works for me. There's no way this would work in the negotiations I do. I'd love to hear that scenario and use that as an example of how collaborative negotiation can work in any negotiation. I'll share some examples where it may seem impossible and give a few tips on then how you can try to resolve that based on the 7 elements of negotiations that we talked about. One example that came from the crowd, thank you, Laura, is I feel like it works sometimes when there's conversations. And sometimes you have to establish conversation before getting into a negotiation. And that I would totally agree, Laurel. And that is an example of those, thinking about those first parts of the negotiation that exist before you even get to the table, the relationship and the communication. And although I mentioned we negotiate multiple times a day, using the example of negotiating the raise, if you're also considering the context, that just might shift what you're negotiating about. So in this example, if you don't necessarily have a long-term relationship, maybe this is someone new, you're beginning to actually meet each other and learn how each other likes to communicate, then what that negotiation might first be is actually just negotiating the conversation to learn more about one another before you're going into a negotiation that's actually about substance that you both care about. So in that particular scenario, you might want to think about the negotiation in more than one part, right? That I'm going to have to start with a negotiation about the relationship to build upon that to negotiate for something in the future. So that's another great example. Some examples that people may feel, well, this doesn't always work. It certainly doesn't work when I'm negotiating with my children. And I would beg to differ there. And one tool that one can use is what's called the listening triangle. And the purpose of the listening triangle is to really continue to get the other party to kind of empty out until you've been able to identify those underlying interests. And the way I think about the listening triangle and how I keep myself reminded of it is I think of it, it is a triangle, and I think of it as cracking the code. So the first step is to ask. Guess what the second step is to do? Yes. The second step, as Laurel stated, is to listen. You're going to tell, but not yet, Jake. So the first step is to ask, and the next step is to listen in that active listening way where you're giving them your undivided attention, you're making eye contact, you're paying attention. And then the next part is the tell. Tell them what you heard so that they know you actually understood what they were sharing. And there's a few ways that you can tell them what you heard. You can actually just repeat it word for word and just parrot it back to them. You can actually try to paraphrase it and take what they said, but perhaps put it in your own words to confirm understanding. But this is also a point where you can now take the information that you heard and reframe it towards the interest. One example I might use is there's a negotiation case that's used in this particular course called Sally Opera, and it's Sally negotiating with an opera house. And Sally may have the position that I want $100,000, I want a private dressing room, and I want you to market me as a star for this show. And I listened to Sally say that. I've heard it. And now I might want to repeat it back to her, but reframe it towards interest. So my telling at this point may be, okay, Sally, so I understand that you want what you consider an equal exchange of value for your contribution to the show. You want us to make sure that you have a private place to be fully prepared for the show. And you want some marketing available to you in exchange for participating in this show in order to help continue to grow your brand. I'm trying to now reframe it to the interest that Sally has for growing her brand as a professional, for receiving financial gain that she believes is equal to what she's contributing, and for having a need for space that allows her to be fully prepared as an artist. All of those things appeal to my interest as well. I want Sally to feel valued here at my opera house. I want her to give the best show she's ever given, so I want to make sure that she has the space available. And I want the house sold out, so I want to market her. But I'm not yet ready to commit to exactly how Sally noted it. So I just might want to reframe what she said towards the underlying interest that I heard versus just repeating the exact amount. But that's the beauty about the listening triangle. It's cracking the code. So if you don't fully understand what she's asking for, or you're not yet at the point where you feel like you can reframe to interest, you might just repeat it and then ask another question and do the triangle again. So perhaps you might repeat what Sally stated when she said, I want $100,000, a private dressing room, and marketing to promote me as a star. And you could say, Sally, I understand you want $100,000, a private dressing room, and marketing to promote you as a star. Can you tell me why those particular things are important to you? And let Sally give you more information. Now you listen. Now you either repeat, paraphrase, or reframe towards the interest and allow Sally to give you confirmation of whether you've got it right. And if you don't, you just do the triangle again until you've gotten to the point where you fully understand why Sally has this particular number, why the dressing room is important to her, why the marketing is important to her, what she means by those things, etc., so that you now have some more information to begin to generate the options that will allow you all to come to a negotiated agreement. Are there any other examples or questions before we close out our session today on how this might work in your own personal life or your professional life, um, or examples of when you've done this recently and found some significant value in just spending more time on identifying the interest to get to the point of an agreement that's collaborative and new and improved?
Yeah, I actually have an example. Well, I hope it doesn't end up being an example, but I've been living in my same apartment for like 4.5 years right now. And the neighborhood I'm in has been consistently improving, but my rent has yet to go up. And I'm hoping it doesn't. But if I am confronted with that situation, how can I, work around that or work with my landlord to, hopefully keep it where I'm at right now, or
Mm,
uh, lower than a lower amount than they might be looking to raise it initially.
okay. Well, if you were prepping for this and thinking about the 7 elements of the negotiation, you've got your relationship with the landlord, you've got a long-term relationship. So not only do they consider you stable, but you consider them stable. And in terms of communication, you also have a lease already that maybe you can also read and use that to prepare for some of the things that you all might discuss. When you're thinking about then your landlord's interest, before you've thought about your own interest, and like, ideally I'd want to stay in this particular place, I like the stability, I'd like to keep my rent between this, in that level, and I like my neighborhood, so I want to be able to stay in that. Like, those are some of your interests. Some of the landlord's interests might be they want to keep a tenant. They want to keep a tenant who has paid on time and has consistently paid on time. They want to keep a tenant. Hold on one second. I'm negotiating with Alexa right now. I apologize. They want to keep a tenant who it has been taking good care of the space. And so they want to maintain you. But they also may need to meet their mortgage that they're paying on the actual building. They also may need to continue to support other properties that maybe the other people can't pay rent during this pandemic. So those are, again, some of the interests that you might want to think of for your particular landlord. Now, once you've thought about those interests, you can begin to think about some of your options. Some of your options might be if they were to present an increase, could we stagger the increase where we're doing it over uh, half in the 6 months, another half in another 6 months? Could we do something where I can commit to a longer term lease if you can hold the increase until year 2 of the lease, and I can commit to 2 years if you can wait for the increase until next year? Those are just like 2 options that I just thought of now, Jake, but that's exactly the point of using the 7 steps to begin to think of those options, so that once you are having the conversation, you actually have some things that you can discuss, and you know what you can, what your alternative is. Like, if your alternative right here would be to find another apartment. Um, and so you might want to begin to do some research there too, and knowing what your BATNA is, that if I can't get to an agreement with this particular landlord, what else am I going to do? And as for objective standards, in having this conversation, you could look at other rent in the area, what's comparable, so that if you are having that conversation, you now have something valid that you can both agree on, that this is what the market is now charging in this particular neighborhood. So that can help you come up with a zone of a possible agreement. Does that help at all?
Yeah, definitely. I hope it never comes up, but it looks like it might. So I appreciate the prep.
That's the good thing. At least you're
Jake, this is
prepared.
Kyle. One thing, I am a landlord and in real estate, and term is your best negotiating tactic. If you're willing to sign like a 2-year term,
Mm.
they'll be way happier to keep your rent lower because turnover costs are expensive.
Okay.
Of cleaning or replacing carpet or painting or whatever happens when you turn over tenants. So if you're willing to sign like a 2-year lease or something like that, they'll be way more willing to talk about lower rent.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you,
Thanks for
Kyle.
sharing that, Kyle. That's another good example. That's another one of your landlord's interests in keeping that turnover cost low. They also don't want to have to take the time of finding a new tenant, all of those things. So thanks for sharing that, Kyle. And that's another good example too of using your resources, right? When you're preparing for the conversation, if you have resources that can support your communication or support how you engage with the relationship, use that in your prep so that you have more data going into the negotiation. Cliff asked, how do you deal with someone on the other side of the table who has all the power and doesn't care whether you reach an agreement or not? So, Cliff, that's one of those things that I, acknowledge that with each negotiation, you are weighing the actual substance and the relationship. And so you have to decide actually what is your best strategy. If in fact they actually have all the power, and I don't know enough about the scenario to say if that is completely true, but that's one question I would ask myself. Do they actually have all of the power? Is that 100% true? And begin to think about that. But if that's the case, and they do actually have all of the power, I want to maintain this relationship in some sort of way, and I know they don't care whether we reach an agreement or not. It may be that your best strategy isn't necessarily collaborative in that particular scenario, and so you've got to go through the prep process to kind of make some of those decisions. If that scenario is one that if I'm too competitive or I attempt to be collaborative, I might actually lose my job, so I can't afford to do that. Maybe that might be a scenario where you are a bit more accommodating. But if that's the case and you're more accommodating in that particular scenario, it could potentially improve the relationship so that in a future scenario, you have the opportunity to be a bit more collaborative or competitive because now the tension has shifted a bit. But the short answer is, Cliff, in every scenario, you have to decide your strategy based on the scenario. But I would still first ask my question, do they in fact have all the power? Because they do also have some underlying interests that exist for them. And if you just spend the time thinking about what those are, you might identify some of your own sources of power in that process.
Yeah, thanks for the observations. I mean, I get a little more specific. As a small service provider, I've negotiated with large electric utilities in the past, and they don't always need another small service provider. And they have so many people that are pitching services. They really will beat you down on price and give you a form contract and say, "Here's the price we'll pay you. Here's the contract. You can take it or leave it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one. And that one, it sounds like you're also just kind of making a business decision, and that if I take this now for the sake of actually gaining the relationship, do I have the opportunity to potentially increase it in the future? And if that's one of the challenges that you're trying to determine, then that's one of the things, that you have to think about before when determining your BATNA. Is right now they're saying their BATNA is their best alternative to a negotiated agreement is to go with one of the other small service providers that I already work with. What's your BATNA in that scenario? Are there perhaps other partners that you could provide your services to that don't have the same policies right now? But it does sound like it's also a part of that business decision on, does it make sense for me to accommodate in the initial negotiations so that I can actually get the relationship with this organization and hopefully be able to increase that over the future.
I think that's a good point, actually. Is there long-term value in the relationship where I can leverage it into a better position in for the next contract. That's a good thought. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Jake, I think we're at about time then.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thank you a lot, Alicia. I definitely learned a lot myself. I'm sure everyone else did too. So appreciate it. And yeah, hope you guys all enjoyed the rest of the evening. We have a lot of cool sessions.